So the fact is that unconscious processes in our heads, they bias our judgment and decision making. And it usually turns out that we come out making even worse decisions than we would otherwise. And we're usually not fully aware of the factors that influence our decisions or decisions of other people quite significantly. So this talk is going to be on how to make yourself aware of these biases as a first step to then achieve better judgment in the future. So our speaker will talk about this talk is Dr. Jordan X. He is a PhD from the University of Virginia, and he built up vast expertise in the topic of decision making and judgment, and published more than 15 academic articles on decision making alone. So he also works with Project Implicit, which is a non-profit focused on raising awareness on the subject of unconscious bias. And they also give talks with companies, for example, to raise the awareness. So I'm really looking forward to this topic, and I would like to ask you, with a warm applause, please welcome on stage Dr. Jordan X.
All right, thank you very much for that nice introduction. So I'm Jordan Axe. I'm a PhD psychology researcher. And today we're going to be going over some research on how unconscious processes might be impacting your judgment, your behavior, and your perception. So I'm going to start the talk today with an image of these two monsters on the screen. All right, can everyone see these two monsters? There's a monster in the back, and he's chasing a monster in the front. When I first started doing this talk, I used to go through the whole charade of, well, who here thinks that the monster in the back is the same size as the monster in the front? Who here thinks that they're different sizes? But at this point, I know that the only reason I'd be asking this question is that the two monsters are actually the same size. So it's my job to prove to you that these two monsters are the same size. To do that, it's really simple. We get rid of that tunnel context, and then there's kind of like a clear instance that this is copy and paste. These are the two exact same shape. But in the next slide, what's going to happen is I'm going to reintroduce that tunnel context. And you're not going to be able to consciously stop yourself from seeing these two monsters as being different sizes. All right, so here comes the tunnel context. There's going to be like a pop-out effect, right? You can't necessarily stop yourself from doing it. And we could spend the rest of the talk, it'd be a really boring talk. We could spend the rest of the talk of you trying consciously to see these two monsters being the same size, but it's not going to happen. This process is being made without your conscious awareness and without your conscious consent. Your unconscious mind is deciding how to best present the world to you. We don't have to go too far into it, but basically your unconscious mind knows from experience that it has to translate this 2D image into a 3D representation. We live in a 3D world. And it knows from experience that when two things take up the same amount of size on your retina, and one of them is implied to be farther away, that thing in real life is actually going to be larger. So your unconscious mind is kind of subtly changing the way that you see the world and making these decisions about how to best present the world to you based on past experience. And what you can see is when you have the same thing over and over, experience can really radically shape the way that we view the world. So here is a video that I saw recently. And this just goes to show how experience can change the way that we view the world. All right, so the people never even notice. There's a bear on the front porch. They walk right by it. They don't even see it. So what can happen here is that thousands and thousands and thousands of times, they've opened that front door and there's been no bear. They don't even have to think about it anymore. And so even now that there might be really important information there, because you've been so rehearsed in processing and seeing the world in one way, you can miss out on some really important information. I kind of like this video because at the end you can see that the bear's expectations are also being violated as well. Usually when he sees people, they freak out. This time they see him and nothing happens. So this is the bear's expectations also being violated. So this is an example of how experience can really radically shape the way your mind works. And you don't have to just see the people on the porch to do this. We're going to do this together. This is a talk that's going to have some some volunteer components. So I'm going to ask you guys, what's going to happen is this arrow is going to move down the side of the screen. And everyone together in the last talk of the day, at least in this room, as the arrow moves down the side of the screen, you're going to tell me the color of the ink of the word. All right, so here's our arrow. You're going to tell me the color of the ink. And here we go. So starting with green, then blue, then red. Here comes our arrow. Nailed it. I knew you guys were a smart crowd. OK, so here's what's going to happen. Now we're going to do the same thing. Again, you're going to tell me the color of the ink. And here's the new list. We're going to see a new arrow. You're going to tell me the color of the ink. So starting with red, then blue, then green, right? Just tell me the color of the ink. Here's our new arrow, moving down the screen. OK, I'm relieved that this works so well in such a bilingual, trilingual audience. But it's unlikely that you forgot your words, the names of the colors in between the first and the second list. What's the difference between the first and the second list is that there's a match between the word itself and the ink on the first list, and there's not a match on the second list. And if you're like me and you're trying to complete this, you have that angel and devil feeling on your shoulder. You want to ignore the word, but you can't stop yourself, and it's there, and that's what really slows you down. So you can see over time, experience is such an important, and you've been reading your entire life that you can't necessarily turn it off, even if you want to. At one point in your life, reading in English or reading words was this really effortful process, but you've been doing it so much that you've lost conscious control. Now, this is called the Stroop Effect, and it works because of a lifetime of experience processing certain information. But the same idea can happen really quickly. Your mind really hates ambiguity, and so it's going to work hard to resolve any ambiguity in front of it, even if that meaning or that stimulus isn't really there. So we're going to play a game now. This game is called What is Taylor Saying? All right, so I'm going to play a clip here. What is Taylor saying? I don't know. Is Taylor saying, I need in my coffee some sugar? OK. Is she saying, I ate my dog, taste was good? Right? That wasn't necessarily there when I first played the clip, but you just need that little bit of a suggestion, and you can't stop yourself from imposing that meaning onto whatever you see in front of you. Because your mind doesn't really like ambiguity, and it takes just a little bit of a nudge, even if it's not a kind of a nonsensical nudge, and it can't stop itself from imposing that meaning, even if it's not really there. So I'll resolve this dissonance. Does anyone want to out themselves as a big Taylor Swift fan at the moment? OK, she's saying I can make all the tables turn, just so you can kind of get that clarity. But that wasn't so clear the first couple times I ran the video. So you can see this same principle at play in what has to be one of my favorite demonstrations here. All right, so I'm going to play an audio clip. I hope this works. We're going to listen to an audio clip right now. Here we go. OK, chances are you didn't get much out of that. That kind of sounds like R2-D2, right? We'll play it one more time. Some beeps and boops for you. OK. Now I'm going to play another clip for you. Here's the second clip.
The Constitution Center is at the next stop.
All right, the lady is saying the Constitution Center is at the next stop. Let me play it one more time. Come on.
The Constitution Center is at the next stop.
OK? Let's see if that changes how we heard that first sound. I'm going to play this clip again. The Constitution Center is at the next stop.
The Constitution Center is at the next stop.
Right? 1 minute ago, this was nothing to you. It didn't mean anything. It was just random boops and beeps. But your mind can adjust so quickly. The Stroop Effect works on it because of a lifetime of experience. This is just 1 minute. You're suggested that maybe you want to hear the Constitution Center is at the next stop. And you can't stop yourself from seeing that from what's in front of you. So all of these are really strong unconscious processes that change the way that we perceive the world. Even if that meaning is not necessarily there, once it's in our heads, we can't stop ourselves from seeing it. So in kind of our last kind of video or audio illusion, we're going to talk about the importance of context for making sense of the world before we get into how these same unconscious processes are at play in the social world. So everyone have a nice look on screen here. There's this nice checkerboard with that green cylinder making that nice shadow. And we have our squares marked A and B. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole charade of, well, who here thinks that A and B are the same color, and who here thinks that they're different colors? Of course they're the same color. It's my job to prove to you that they're the same color. And to do that, it's very simple. All I need to do is introduce two squares in one context that are very clearly the same. So everyone have a nice look on the left side of the screen there. On a white background, this is, again, copy and paste. Very clear that this is the same color gray. When we slide these gray squares into a new context, it's going to be equally clear to your perception that they're different colors. So here we go. Right? So this is not some sort of magic trick. I'm not some sort of PowerPoint wizard, right? What makes these demonstrations so striking is that all the work is being done inside your own mind. And basically what your mind is doing is that it has to make some tough decisions about how to best see the world. And it sees this checkerboard, and it really wants to prioritize that checkerboard, even if it has to compensate for the shadow made by that green cylinder. And it wants to prioritize showing you a really clear, coherent checkerboard. So it has to play with what it means for something to be light gray or dark gray. And so in this case, what ends up being light gray in the dark is the same thing as what's dark gray in the light. So we'll do this one more time. In one context, very clear that they're the same. In another context, very clear that they're different. Now, how might these same processes be at play in the social world? Think about the importance of context. What you're seeing here is images from media coverage of Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005 in New Orleans. And in one context, it might be very clear to us that this is the same behavior, people in the water trying to survive. In another context, the context of race and stereotypes, you can have a very different perception of the world. So these are the captions that went along with the images. So the top one is described as a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. Bottom one described as two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. So one of these, obviously, much more negative description than the other, which is a little bit more neutral. It's not just one unfortunate instance. And more formal analyses of all the media coverage that came out of Hurricane Katrina, if the person in the image was black, significantly more likely to be depicted negatively compared to if the person in the image was white. And I think if you rounded up all the photographers and the caption writers and you asked them, did you mean to try and portray one group more negatively than another, I think a large percent of them would say, no, it's my job to tell you what I saw, and that's exactly what I did. But hopefully what you're beginning to understand is that the way that we consciously see and perceive the world is really the end result of a lot of unconscious processes. So you can arrive at feelings that you're being fair or that you're seeing the world as it is, but you might actually not be noticing these unconscious processes and how they shape the world. And to understand a little bit more about how this might happen, you need to know a little bit more about stereotypes. So I'm a social psychologist. I research stereotypes. That's long been a study of social psychology. These are the results of two Princeton researchers in 1933. All they did was they went out and they said, what are some stereotypes that you have about different groups? So apologies for some of the language on here. We've kind of updated, but this is 1933. So this is what they were using. And you can see that some of these stereotypes are still very much with us today, but some of them have maybe faded over time. But if I asked you, maybe the extent to which people consciously support these stereotypes, I imagine that we wouldn't see much support for them. And the nice thing about this study is that it's been rerun, replicated every 10 years or so. And you can see that conscious endorsement of stereotypes really has gone down. So on the x-axis here is a trait that was once ascribed to African Americans. On the y-axis, percent of people willing to say, yes, I believe African Americans have this trait. Different color bars represent when the study was run. And you can see for a lot of the traits, people are less willing to report that they believe in that stereotype for that group. Now, maybe some of this is because people are just less willing to admit that, but we've seen this over and over and over again, that these are really large changes in the amount to which people consciously believe in stereotypes. But what's interesting about this study is, if I asked you, not what do you believe, but what does the culture believe? What are popular ideas in the culture? I imagine you'd be able to largely recreate this list that's in front of me. You'd be able to say, Jordan, I don't believe in these, but these are popular ideas in our culture. And what social psychologists over the last 20 years or so have been interested in is, well, what are the psychological effects of not necessarily believing in a stereotype, but being exposed to it? And so we're going to go through one of these tools right now. It's called the Implicit Association Test, IAT. This is also going to be a participatory part of this. So let's see if this works well. All right, I'll make it work. That didn't work. Give me 1 second here. This is all riveting, I'm sure. mirror display. All right, let's go back to it. Here is, so here's what's going to happen. Did that work? All right, great. Here's what's going to happen. Images of spiders or puppies are going to show up one at a time in the middle of the screen. When it is an image of a spider, you are going to tell me left. When it's an image of a puppy, you're going to tell me right. Spider, left, puppy, right. Once about half the people in the group tell me left or right, I'm going to press the space bar, and a new image is going to come up. So again, spider, left, puppy, right. Here we go. Right, left. OK, you guys know your left and your right. I'm very proud of you. All right, so now we're going to do pleasant and unpleasant words. If it's a pleasant word, you tell me left. If it's an unpleasant word, you tell me right. Pleasant, left, unpleasant, right. Right. All right. Now we're going to do both at the same time. I know it's late, but I think you guys can do it, all right? I'm really proud of you. I have faith in you, OK? Pleasant word or a spider, you tell me left. Unpleasant word or a puppy, you tell me right. Pleasant or spider, left. Unpleasant or puppy, right. Here we go. OK, we'll call that about 1,200 milliseconds. You probably know where this is going. We're going to switch sides real quick. If you're going to tell me left for a puppy, right for a spider. Left, puppy, right, spider. Here we go. All right, last block. Pleasant or puppy, you tell me left. Unpleasant or spider, you tell me right. Pleasant or puppy, left. Unpleasant or spider, right. Here we go. OK, about 1,000 milliseconds. So hopefully you felt it within yourself, or you heard it in the errors being made around you, that one combination was much easier for us to work through than another combination. It was easy for us to work with when good and puppy were paired together and bad and spider were paired together. Harder for us when it was the opposite. And the implicit association test, IAT, uses the speed at which you move through these blocks to infer how strongly these concepts are tied together in your memory. So when two things are really strongly tied together in your memory, that should be easy and it should speed you up. When two things are more distantly tied together, it should slow you down. Now, that's only 200 millisecond difference. That might not seem like a long time. But to a cognitive or social psychologist, that's like a lifetime. That's like an eon. All we had to do was tell you how to categorize the words. And we found that one combination was easier than another. And now we use the IAT. I'm not going to go through the other examples of it, but we use the IAT to assess a lot of maybe more socially sensitive issues as well. Is that working? Yes. And so, obviously we don't just use it to measure associations of spiders and puppies. Most people here would be comfortable telling me that they prefer puppies to spiders. But when it comes to issues like race, when the people have to sort white and black faces and good and bad words, if you're like the people who come to our website, 70% of people say that they don't have a conscious preference between races. But implicitly, unconsciously, it's a different story. We find that about, again, 70% of people who come to our website, it's easier for them to work through those blocks when white faces and good words are paired together and black faces and bad words. Much harder when it is black faces and good words, white faces and bad words. So we're kind of using the IAT to understand what might be going on implicitly and how might that influence people's behavior. So here are my own results. I do this for a living. It's not much of a living at the moment, but I do this for a living. And I, too, show this IAT effect, right? I am slower when it's white and bad and black and good, and I'm faster, lower bars when it's white and good and black and bad. And if you're again, like the white participants who come to our website, 81% of them have this kind of pro-white racial bias. And among black participants, it's more in the middle. So among our black participants, it's more like they don't show a bias either way. We kind of use this to infer that people's implicit biases, their IAT scores, are shaped both by their own group, people like their own group, and the cultural values that they're exposed to throughout their life. And so for white participants, these might be pointing in the same direction. For black participants, they might be kind of contrasting. And that's what gets that null effect, kind of tug-of-war effect. But again, we don't just do this for race. We do this for a lot of different stereotypes, ideas, associations. This is a version where we have people sort male and female names and words related to science versus arts. And what we find is this kind of male equals science bias, such that for about 70% of both our male and female participants, it's easier for them to pair male names and science words and female names with liberal arts words compared to the opposite. So these are robust biases. But they don't just exist in the way that we click buttons really fast on a computer. They can also shape our actual judgments. So this is my own studies. I asked people, it's your job to select applicants for this new academic honor society or a job. Here are the applicants. You have to sort out the good ones and the bad ones. You should take about half. So you have to reject or accept some. And you see a bunch of these applicants over and over. And eventually, we manipulate the social information available to you. So another bias that we're very interested in is physical attractiveness. That's a very pronounced bias that guides a lot of judgments. So people do this study. They have to see these applicants. And some of them are randomly paired with Botticellis. And some of the applicants are randomly paired with Picassos. Okay? They actually see real human faces, but I like to use my Picasso stand-ins because it's kind of mean to put up someone's face and say that they're not that physically attractive. But our participants see real human faces. We know that they're actually identically qualified. But we see from their judgment how they evaluate these participants. And we don't have to get too far into this, but this is something called criterion. Basically, lower scores here mean that you're easier on people from that group. It's easier to get into this academic honor society if you have lower scores. Perhaps this surprise of no one, among all participants, there's this pro-physical attractive bias. But we asked people 2 questions afterwards. We asked them, did you want to use physical attractiveness? 92% of people say, I didn't want to use physical attractiveness at all in my judgments. Here's how they look. We also asked people, did you use physical attractiveness? Did you notice how physically attractive someone was when you were making your decisions? And 80% of people say, I didn't use it at all. Here's how they look. Right? They're a little bit better, but they're still kind of showing this physical attractiveness bias. And I like this study, not just because I did it, but because it shows that there are really 2 victims here. One victim is the actual applicant, in that we like to think that we live in a world where our looks didn't determine our outcomes so much. But another victim here is the organization itself. Because when these biases are baked into your judgment and decision making, over time you're going to get less and less qualified people, and you're really only hurting yourself. So there's the victim of the applicant and the victim of the organization itself. So that's why we think these are worth addressing. And I'm going to skip over some of this right now because I'm running out of time. Let me tell you about ways to think about reducing implicit bias. That's probably why a lot of you are here. I don't have some sort of secret answer to give you, but there's some things that we suggest where there might be more potential to limit the impact of implicit bias. So focus less on changing your individual level of implicit bias. A lot of people take our implicit association test, and they work real hard to lower their implicit association test score. Instead, focus more on changing the chance that your implicit biases will be allowed to operate. Restructure your decision-making environment so they're not even have the chance of being impacted by this information. So I'm going to go over a couple of situations where we think people are most likely to show biases in their judgment. Here's one: when the information is complex or confusing, or when the decision-making criteria are unclear. So let me walk you through a sample study here. Participants see Michael versus Michelle. They have to decide who's going to be the next police chief. In one condition, Michael is streetwise, Michelle is formally educated. Who do participants choose? Michael. Why? Because being streetwise is more important. You have to be very streetwise to get this job done. OK, that's one condition. Other condition, you have to choose between Michael and Michelle. Who do the participants choose? Michael. But why? Because being formally educated is more important. People are flexible with the criteria that they use to decide. So we know that really it's gender that's driving these judgments. But to the participant, it's very easy to explain that away in a way that's not biased. I liken this to the phenomenon of treating yourself to something. If you've ever wanted to treat yourself to something, you notice that the desire comes first, the justification comes second. I'm having a really terrible day. What better way to end this terrible day than by getting myself this thing that I want? Or I'm having a really great day. What better way to keep this great day going than by getting myself this thing that I want? Desire comes first, justification comes second. And so our advice is that you need to set objective criteria in advance and know which factors relate to performance. When people had to commit ahead of time, what's more important, being streetwise or being formally educated? When they had to make that commitment before even seeing the applicants, they were much more consistent, and gender bias went way down. Same thing with feelings of accountability. When people were told that you're going to have to justify this decision to your experimenter afterwards, they were much less likely to use gender in their evaluation. They're much more consistent. So same things with our physical attractiveness studies. When people are warned ahead of time, you're going to have to walk us through why you made the decisions that you made, bias goes down. Another place where people are most likely to show bias is when decisions are made rapidly, or they're made when people are stressed or tired. So this is obviously probably not a controversial idea that people are worse when they're very tired. Here's an alarming study. This is the rate of hand washing among hospital employees throughout a shift. So on the left side of the screen is when people just start out their shift. On the right side of the screen is hour 12 of a 14-hour shift. And over the course of their shift, hand washing goes way down. Now, it's not as if they value hand washing any less during hour 12 than in hour 1. But when people are tired, they're looking for shortcuts just to get something over with. And those are the cases where bias is most likely to creep into your judgment. Same thing here. This is a kind of a fun study. This is the frequency of recess across Dutch elementary schools. Why am I showing you the frequency of recess across Dutch elementary schools? So those spikes are when there was a lot of recess activity. And you can compare the test scores of kids who take their national standardized tests right before recess versus right after recess. And basically, lower bars here mean that you're doing worse. Those schools that test right before recess, you're not doing that well. They test right after recess, they're doing much better. So some advice here would be to think slowly and restructure your decision-making for more consistency and slow decision-making. That's easier said than done, but whatever little thing you can do to make more consistency or slow down when you're making these types of decisions, that's going to be helpful. All right, I'm going to go over one more example of when people are most likely to show bias. It's when people are unaware of bias, or they're unmotivated to fix it. So this is an example from Juilliard admissions in the 1960s and 70s. They had this large gender imbalance such that disproportionately more men were getting into Juilliard than women. This is the prestigious musical college. And so in the 1960s and 70s, they made one change to their application process. And over the course of the following years, the gender disparity at least lessened. It didn't actually go away, but at least lessened. So what was the change that they made? Does anyone know? Blind auditions, right? It's one trip to Bed Bath & Beyond, or whatever the equivalent is over here. You get that shower curtain, you put it up in front of people, and now you can't even have that information when you're making these evaluations. But an example of people being vigilant, they found that that wasn't enough. Just blind auditions wasn't enough. People's gender information was still getting through. Does anyone know how it was getting through? Shoes. There's the click, click, click of high heels walking across a floor that signaled that the applicant was female. And this probably wasn't something they thought of initially, but over time they saw that this gender information was still getting through. So now when you work and apply for orchestras across the world, you have to wear your comfiest sneakers. You're not allowed to make a sound as you walk across the stage, because these are people being very vigilant about not even letting that information into their decision making at all. So here's what happened after they started introducing blind auditions. You'll notice we're not quite at 50% yet, but we're getting better. So when are people most likely to show bias? The solution here is don't trust yourself to ignore unwanted information. Set it aside entirely. When we're running my physical attractiveness studies, it's so clear what we're doing, but no one ever just puts their hand over the photo. Right? Everyone's confident in their ability that I can see that and I can ignore it. But really, we know from social science research that that's too optimistic. And that really, once that information's out there, it's like toothpaste getting out of a tube. Once it's out, it's not going back in. So as much as you can, limit the availability of this information at all. And I said, be vigilant, create practices with the idea that you are biased. So there are some just to show you that this idea is catching on in the tech world, here's a Google Chrome plugin called Unbias Me. You add this onto your computer. It gets rid of people's faces and where they went to college for their LinkedIn profile. I'm not here to vouch for it, but this is just examples of how this is catching on in the tech world. Here's a startup called Textio. They use kind of machine learning to scroll through your job ads to see if you might be using subtly biased language. So for example, if you use the word ninja or rock star in your job ad, chances are you're going to get more male than female applicants. So this is a startup. I'm not vouching for them at all, but this is just an example of this catching on in the tech world. So combating implicit bias, there's no magical bullet, but use objective decision making, create accountability, think slowly, and just be vigilant. So before I get some questions, I just want to get some plugs in. If you want to take some IITs yourself about things not like puppies and spiders, please come visit us at Project Implicit, implicit.harvard.edu. You can take IITs about a number of different things. You get feedback at the end and more information about how the test operates. So kind of a takeaway point here, these are wind masks. They were a popular idea in the 1910s and 20s. They thought that you could get rid of wrinkles by limiting the exposure to the wind. Didn't really work out. But it's a nice image in thinking that we see the world through our pre-existing beliefs and associations, and those can really strongly color the way that we view others. And so in order to arrive at this more unbiased and perception of the world, you need to have a better appreciation for these unconscious processes and what you can do to eliminate them. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll take some questions right now.
Thank you very much for a very insightful talk. Thanks, Jordan. So we have a few questions on Slido. Let's pick them up one by one. How do you use the unconscious processes in business? I'm not sure. Who asked the question? Do you want to elaborate what's meant? Not putting you under the gun here, but do you understand the question? How do you use?
Well, I mean, I think that a couple of the processes that I talked about very clearly apply themselves to types of things like hiring and promotion. And so anytime that you might be evaluating other people, either internally or externally, thinking about who to take on, these unconscious processes could be at play.
OK. So there's an interesting question. How do you manage to challenge those subconscious stereotypes when they're enforced by the surroundings or media? Or how can you make people be more aware when they make decisions based on their subconscious preference?
So I think that's a good question. So I think that there's kind of there's a short game and a long game. I think in a long game, maybe if we work to change media representations or things like that, we might actually see changes on things like IIT scores. But when we've done analyses over the last 10 or 15 years of IIT scores, for example, pro-white bias, we don't see much change. And that makes a lot of sense to me because if we think a lifetime of exposure is what's going into these, the idea that you can change it quickly is too optimistic. So instead of just if that's the long game, maybe we can change some of these media representations or other factors. The short game is trying to adopt these strategies that limit the chances that these implicit biases can even operate. And just because unconscious bias is an influence doesn't mean that you can't limit that influence. So sure, maybe some part of your judgment is driven by unconscious processes, but if you make people aware, if you make people feel accountable, then their behavior in the moment will be more related to actual explicit preferences and desires. So it's not as if it's you have to just throw your hands up to the wind to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, next question you mostly address in a way, what are the bias traps companies, coworkers fall into? Maybe just frame it differently. So we talked about recruiting and promotion. Are there like other areas where you clearly see there's a trap that people tap in all the time regularly when it's in a company?
So another bias that I didn't necessarily get into was the idea that a lot of times we're not focused on these biases because they maybe feel good in the moment, and that's because a lot of bias is perpetuated by helping someone out, helping a friend out. You know, you do someone a favor, and you're not thinking about all the people who didn't get that same opportunity in the moment. And so, for example, I give this talk to a lot of lawyers, and they have a big lunch culture. Who you go to lunch with is really important, and that can open up a lot of doors in your life. But it doesn't feel that important. One lunch decision doesn't really mean much. But these things can accumulate over time such that there's disparities in who gets what. So another trap is that there's really informal decisions that people aren't thinking about, and those can also perpetuate these biases.
Do you have the feeling that like others are explicitly trying to influence informal decisions by like trying to go to lunch with others or go to drinks or, you know, the socializing aspect? Like
I mean, that's certainly an explicit goal that people have. But maybe when the people who are really more high up, the person who's being who you want to go to lunch with, they're not thinking about it as much in the moment. Sure, I'll go to lunch with this person, or who should I go to lunch with? Look right down the hall and not really think about, maybe I should spread this more evenly. So I ask people to keep track of who you're going to lunch with throughout the year, and maybe at the end of the year you can see some pretty big disparities in who gets what access.
All right. So a last question, and I have the feeling you kind of answered it by saying that we have to remove the possibility for a bias to kick in. It says, do you believe that your slides just prove the effectiveness of mental training, e.g. that we can train to choose what we believe and see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, going back to what I was saying earlier, just because it's unconscious, just because it's implicit, doesn't mean it's something that you can't work to change. So there are things that you can do to make sure that less of your judgment is impacted by these implicit biases. So again, things like accountability, things like being aware ahead of time. We even find that if you warn people ahead of time, hey, look out for physical attractiveness when you're making these judgments, that reduces the bias. It doesn't eliminate it. But it does suggest when people know what to focus on, when people know what to think about, then they can be a little bit more proactive in reducing these biases.
Give it up for John. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.